Hello everyone, today we talk about ancient and medieval warship performance. I inserted here and there some images of normal ships just to make math a little, because it's a relatively general overview about probably just the ship's capabilities per se, right? And the, of course, reflection of this in combat, like how did things work and why that way, and also, of course, during the movements from port to port before the engagements, etc. I already made some videos telling the truth about ancient and medieval naval warfare. I started from a couple of years a series. I don't update it very often, but it's important because the essentials of it are crucial for the understanding not just of naval warfare per se, but what this was functional to, that is to say, essentially the support of land armies. This is what basically throughout this entire period fleets were meant to do in the first place. So there are also lots of analogies, telling the truth, between naval and terrestrial warfare. We'll get to some of them also today. But let's say the concreteness of this ship's performance is useful to explain also how relative it was to the strategic and tactical purpose. That is to say, from one side, historically, let's say, it's difficult to give figures for such actual performance, right? For the simple reason that during ancient medieval times, we do not have, first of all, an overwhelming amount of documentation on warfare, at least to the degree that would allow us to know exactly for each ship, or at least the general. As we'll see, we're pretty uniform throughout the say in the various contexts that we're going to see. That naval technology changed quite gradually, and so just like for land armies, you have essentially most of the times armies that fight against other de facto identical ones, and or that have different characteristics that are, however, still secondary to the strategic and tactical essentials. And the other aspect is, of course, just the reality of the situation, what we can assess just because of physics, right? The fact that there are certain speeds involved here that cannot be surpassed, or even if they would, they do not, in that sense, they would not serve the actual purpose for which the ships were employed in combat, for example. This is true for, like, just imagine we're talking about cavalry, right? What is the fastest speed of a war horse relevant to how cavalry charges were carried out? Obviously not. Actually, it would have been very dangerous for the same effectiveness of the maneuver and of the action at that point. A bit the same is true for ships that surely are less maneuverable. So naturally there are specific differences between, I don't know, I make the example of the horse of the horseman, between the and the one of the galley and the crew, right? This goes without saying. But there are many other factors involved. First and foremost, the sea, the wind, the currents, but of course also the concrete contingencies of warfare. For example, the fact that crews, like land units, were usually understrength, right? And that all possible things could go wrong, and we know this in warfare. We know that even after the battle is over, from Clausewitz, there's no real way to tell precisely what happened. It's just, I don't know, think about what you have done this morning and just try to give it some kind of numerical, quantitative dimension, write it down to describe what happened. It's always going to be historically incomplete, right? And sometimes silence is also a much more substantial indicator of what actually happened than the noise. Let's say that some actual source telling us about this and that. This is obvious in many circumstances. This depends also on the peoples, on the cultures. For example, I don't know, the Greeks were very technologically biased to a certain degree. They describe battles with a very specific rational schematism. Not always, but still more than how, I don't know, a rough Roman would describe, if he had described it at all, a naval combat that he would see mostly as a moral issue, just like any other for that matter. There were lots of intersections to these models, right? The Vikings do not tell us anything, or almost, at least, exposed in that case. So it really depends from place to place. I will not treat this specifically, but given that we covered this entire time of naval warfare, I was just making these examples for the sake of example, in fact. And reconstructing a naval battle definitely is actually more complex than it's a more difficult task, at least, say the least, if possible at all, than reconstructing a land battle, right? Because generally speaking, naval battles, first of all, were rare, right? Even if we look at Greek or Roman warfare, you have some peaks, some moments during, I don't know, the Persian Wars, the Civil Wars, things like that, where of course there are great memorable naval battles, but most of these countries' history was, again, about terrestrial engagements, and again, the point of fleets was fundamentally to allow either the crossing of an army from over sea, or simply supplying it, supporting it, in order to go make it operate somewhere else. Think about, I don't know, the Persians trying to invade properly the heart of Hellas and subduing it for good. They needed, of course, to transport an enormous amount of resources via ship. If anything, the narrowness of Greece in those places, and just the unspeakable amount, literally, of supplies that were needed for that expedition at such great distance from the Achaemenid mainland, the core land, let's say, is just self-explanatory. So land battles are also more manageable. Again, at sea you are basically relying on a dumb piece of wood that you have to handle in a way that, of course, is not directly connected to how you personally not just wield the sword, but actually also move an entire unit. The point of these battles was also that most of the engagement was got down to the same nature of land battles, that is to say, boarding, right? And so an engagement between the marines that, as we have seen, for example, in the video about the Roman militares classiari, were basically saying legionnaires, right? So there was a lot of important things marines were trained to do, including moving in an incredibly complex way that required an enormous amount of training as far as ramming, for example, was concerned. And again, just think, if you have an understrength army, or one just scrapped, put together at the moment, how are they going to play? The Clausewitzian laws of reciprocity, it's that complex. So the ships used in the Mediterranean carried both oars and sails, right? Although it's notorious as invariable that the crews would leave the main mast and sail behind while going into action, right? Because these were extremely vulnerable to especially fire. The main maneuvers were essentially based on oaring, and in fact this very, as we will see now, very highly and precisely performing galley movements that, of course, were reduced. We will see it now. It was not much about what the single galley did. That one of the similarities between naval and terrestrial warfare is that in the latter, you have still essentially battle lines, right, with all these ships crammed together to try to break the enemy line and to outflank each other, but there is not much of a movement, right? Again, those horsemen or hoplites in battle would do more things than the ship, right? Individually during combat. As we will see, there are some maneuvers such as the diekplos, the periplos, that essentially were getting down to the same thing. So attacking the enemy ships from the rear or the flank, right? The diekplos simply the only difference consisting the former breaking through the enemy ship line, and so getting past it and sailing around. The other one simply sailing around the entire battle line, so outside of the array. And of course, there was no, like just on land battles, there was no, not much of a difference between this armies and fleets, meaning that everybody would actually use these maneuvers. Yes, you needed specific conditions. We've seen often in some battle videos also about the Peloponnesian War, how, of course, the size, banally, of the fleet, so the number of ships, but also their type dictated essentially how the engagement was going to unfold, how you couldn't literally you could do everything, but not necessarily the conditions would allow that to be more favorable sometimes than others. And generally speaking, these engagements got down, just like on land battles, on concentrated mass, and then the possibility of trying to outflank the enemy in a way or another, but only with specific care, with, say, also with exploiting surprise when achievable, and lots of other issues that have also to do with the weather, and so on, of course. Now, another important aspect is to be considered here is that these ships did not have keels, right? So this caused a considerable leeway when sails were rising, so that the latter were useful only when the wind was favorable. We will go back to it as far as just less strained voyages were concerned, because there were different speeds, right, that the ships would have depending on the context. But it was indeed observed that a fleet made better time under oars over a long voyage and not sail, right, despite the strain on the rowers, right, for obvious reasons. It was just more direct, to the point. It could just happen at any time. Of course, the weather influenced the performance as well, but still, rowing was making you less dependent on wind, which is not always there to serve you. And so it was preferred, even in that circumstance. On a long voyage, it was in any case usual, whether under oars or sail, to stop at night and anchor or beach. This was the case just for the obvious reason that visibility in the dark is limited, and given that these ships made the overwhelming amount of time coastal navigation, could be very dangerous, right, to sail without the necessary visibility. Simply, the crews had to rest, right? And there were ways and ways to do this for different purposes. Warships, for example, often stopped in the middle of the day to allow the crews to cook dinner ashore, which evidently couldn't be done that comfortably on the ship, which could have also caused accidents. Everything could catch fire for that matter. There were systems, including water pumps, to for any Athenians. But that's not fire and wood, not a great combination. Plus all the other the sailing material and also some provisions and so on. So there was properly a strong connection with the coast, with the sense that especially every day you had to stop, right? And as we will see now, fleets normally performed 30 miles per day, which is exactly the same amount that an army on land would optimally do, right? I say optimally, but this is really the average that could be performed, right? People think that, I don't know, in the ancient world, armies were faster than medieval ones. This is BS, right? They always march at the same identical speed everywhere, right? And unless we're talking, and sometimes even more, telling the truth, you have some armies that could perform even double that. And for fleets, we're talking about the same thing. But the standard was, if not 30 miles, say 30 kilometers per day. Perhaps fleets had it relatively easier to go a bit faster, but they were, in this sense, still limited by the working force of the oarers. Most of the time, so you could have a very favorable wind that could help in that. You could even sum the two things. Mostly, as we will see, sails were used just to also make the oarers rest, for that matter. This 30 miles per day were covered at an average speed of about 3-4 knots. So we're talking about 5.5 to 7.5 kilometers per hour, right? So you understand, everything lasted, I don't know, an average of 5 hours of rowing, 6 hours of rowing, something like that in a day. And as we were saying before, the fact that normally these ships had to stop at the end of the day even shaped the political geography of the world, meaning that along the coastlines you would see a correspondence between the centers, the settlements' distances, right? That were often around 30 miles because they hopped from port to port, located more or less at that distance from one another. Right, we've seen it just recently in the video I made about the Republic of Ragusa, Dubrovnik, right? That, we do not know that, like, very up to a certain time back in the day, but we noticed that, the port was located at an equal, something like 30 kilometers distance between the other two major ports, north and south of the Dalmatian coast, which makes us think that was some sort of stop there available for ships from an old age. And of course, there were other smaller stations, but very often, at least in a war zone, those coasts were contested. Was relatively dangerous even just to land. You had to take the adequate precautions, even with your own your own embarked infantry to garrison the landing and so on. Now, on occasion, fleets did cross open sea. This was feasible, just technologically speaking. There was this great talk: did the ancients reach the Americas before the medievals? Well, it may be easily, because there is really nothing against that, right? The reason why we do not see connections historically is that the bases were too the power bases of the peoples who could do this were too far away to be interested in such a long journey, like to consistently colonize such large distance. But of course, people traveled far and wide. We know even the Pacific was crossed, with much more primitive ships than these ones, and the world was already globalized to some degree at that point. But when it gets to war fleets that, of course, are a massive asset, and of course can be moved across sea, but with a risk that you have to measure on the base of your political, strategic interests, whatever, we notice pretty interesting performances as well. For example, Ptolemy in 306 BC took 350 ships from Egypt to Cyprus. We're talking about something like 470 kilometers as the crow flies. In 253 BC, the Romans set off from Panormus in Sicily, direct to Rome, losing 150 ships in a storm on the way. We're talking about 400 kilometers here. So these are not, say, short distances. You see the risks involved, and think about the cost of 150 ships. Admittedly, at that point, Rome wasn't paying excessive attention to resources because she had plenty of, but still, right? We don't have to exaggerate that either. Faster is better when it doesn't get worse, like in this case, but as you understand, you can achieve political and strategic surprise. You can simply dispose of these ships faster, even if you want to dismantle them, albeit in that case you wouldn't quite risk them in this crossing like that. However, the overwhelming reasons connected with this decision are separated from the performance of the ships themselves, right? Rather with the causes why those ships are there in the first place, have been built in the first place, and you want to keep using them for some other purpose. Now, under battle conditions, the main factor affecting performance was the standard of rowing, right? This went far beyond ship design per se. It was just about the quality of the crew, of the commanders, and this as far as the ship's performance were concerned. As we were saying before, yes, the ship performance can include also tactics like ramming, etc., where literally everyone on deck has to move very, very precisely that way in order to carry out this very difficult maneuver, telling the truth, at least if you want to make it successful. But it's obvious again that it's these people that make the thing and not much the technology per se. As always, doctrine is everything, technology alone is zero, literally. Of course, ship designs varied to some degree. This is not just about the size per se. Of course, this was not a fully standardized world. But as we'll see now, ships pretty much looked similar. Like the various classes, categories were pretty much the same. They were also, in this sense, difficult to distinguish from one another, which is true for land armies as well. We have this idea that, I don't know, a Gallic army looked different from a Roman one, to a degree, yes, but say most of the distinctions were a matter of, say, what we can say, uniform to a degree, made multiple videos and this banners, whatever. The same was for the ships. Now, there were light and heavy variants of the various types of warship. In general, however, these standards were the same from fleet to fleet. And even more than land armies, telling you the truth, because there were many other ways to go at war at sea, right? Even, let's say, there were more primitive peoples, say tribes, who also had fleets of some importance, but overall they had a much scarcer kind of mass cohesion in the first place. So let's say that especially in ancient times, like Mediterranean civilizations were the ones who had not just the greater power, but the ones who had standardized the most, also the the finest doctor, right? They just would be able to integrate and maintain an impressive amount of naval forces on a regular basis, provided that, again, there weren't ships like to the same extent than in emergential situations all the time around, right? Ships serve the purpose of deterrence against these smaller vessels, and in fact, of pirates and so on. In fact, you literally have entire periods in history, like from the time of Pompey Caesar to the 3rd century crisis, where you literally do not hear of piracy, right? It's not that there wasn't in absolute terms, but you hear much greater problems on land on a regular basis, which tells you how, in the sense that the technological asset was just something that you had to invest above a certain soil that otherwise you couldn't quite even compete with anybody. All right, and always remember that this was always connected with the land capabilities. The Mediterranean was the most safely secured land in the first place, but also venturing in it just from somewhere else was less practicable than it would be just to launch a land raid of some sort. Now, the dress and equipment of the crew was, as we were saying before, often the only indication of wherever identity you had, politically, militarily, culturally, right? We know that there were some sort of uniforms. For example, the Roman sailors apparently wore blue, among other colors. Anyway, here we will not descend in also other details that we know about. For example, the river fleets that operated in a relatively different way from the, just we're talking about the ship performance. Of course, they were also different types of vessels, but substantially they were the same machines. Let's put it this way. Prizes were usually welcome reinforcements, right? Nevertheless, light ships were faster than heavy, right? In fleets relying on maneuverable built light as policy. However, a light ship with poor rowers was inferior to a heavy ship with good rowers, and this was the actual thing, right? Rowing was pretty much everything. It was just about the mobility of the ship, and if you essentially manage to outmaneuver the enemy, you can acquire a much greater advantage also in the moment in which this ship is going to is trying to fight back at you. And of course, different things can happen. However, once that a ship is blocked at a point, either they manage to board the others and opening literally a way to the enemy deck, seizing the enemy ship entirely, or they're gonna have a very hard time because they can be targeted from multiple sides and so on. You need, just like on land, some numerical superiority, but the ship is also more cumbersome, right? And it can, to a degree, protect you as a sort of fortress, but the naval engagements were quite active, right? I remember years ago there was a person on another place, like, it's nothing to do with Schwerpunkt, who, in a group of military experts, was arguing that before the Roman corpus, there was no such thing like boarding, right? Boarding, of course, existed ever since warships were used. In the first place, it's that easy. It was carried out through some ladders, other means, and the aggressiveness in that regard, the fact that it's not much the ship in itself, it's not even, of course, ramming or catapults or whatever, but it's primarily, just like on land, the fight between the marines that makes the thing is is a bit, in fact, overshadowed by those modernistic prejudices about the technical performance, just per se, and always considering that everything works with masses of ships during the greater engagements, at least. So tactics go beyond the individual, right? The success is about the collective capacity, and this entails all a series of effective of expertise, of competence, experience, etc., that go beyond the mere performance of an individual ship. And we will see other naval campaigns and battles. As we were saying before, rowing was crucial, and as such was the rower's stamina. As a consequence, the stamina is limited, thus there were different speeds for ancient warships that had to regulate this to an incredible level of precision for properly the entire energy management of the ship. Now, the maximum speed was attained with all the rowers exerting their full power. Right? This performance could be maintained only for about 20 minutes. It was not meant to be continuative, right? Unless you were being chased. But in 20 minutes, you're not going to go too far away, at least if you're just really desperate. Consider that there would be situations in which you could even overstrain the rowers, saying, better having your muscles and tendons collapsing than being killed, right, or made prisoner, and so on. So these things happened, and much worse, telling the truth, all the time. However, this maximum speed was surely used in combat, especially, as I understand it, in the moments of the smashing against the enemy lines, the general possibility of maneuvering on the enemy flank, and so on. So those would be the cases. However, as we were saying before, as on land battles, maintaining the line cohesion was very, very important, right? So it's not that difficult to do. You can tie the ships to one another. So there are things that you can do that on the field. At least sometimes it did happen, right? I can think about some Sasanian squires being literally tied to their masters or things like that. Because the important thing, however, on sea is to maintain this giant bridge, basically, of wood as a major platform to engage with the enemy in melee and missile and so on. If the enemy doesn't manage to break through, you may even suffer enormous losses, but managing to maintain control of these ones, because you can't even just pour all the troops that you want across the various ships. So most this naval engagements would look like pretty attritional muscle to muscle strength force, as is, where the ships would be all locked into one another while the Marines were killing each other on the decks, and the rowers effectively didn't do much, as we will see now in that specific circumstances. So that's also why the performance were reduced, right, in that instance, right. Then there was an intermediate speed, which was the fast cruise, involving all the rowers at an easy stroke. This could be maintained for perhaps 3 hours maximum. A battle would be fought, at least in the speediest moments, at speeds between the maximum and the fast cruise. All right. So it's just like, as we were saying before, in land battles, it's not really the fastest that is going to make the thing better. You must be able to handle yourself too, which during the fastest speed is not easy, right? For example, directing, again, moving during during ramming, like across the deck, like the water surface is unstable, right? So of course the speedier you get, and the say the straighter you can point, you can get that. But at that point, even a minimal variation can change things. So everybody has to be extremely focused, shifting the balance on deck where it's needed before impact, and this could require also a relative slowdown, even though I think that the let's say the possibility of increasing or slowing the speed at that point were say we're not just going at the instant, and the momentum gained to the end of smashing into an enemy ship also has a lot to do with the same mass of the ship. So just like cavalry charges at some point were carried out at pace, right? Some of the heaviest units would, right? Because that speed is enough to successfully maintain cohesion and still to smash because of the sheer amount of mass that you're moving, at the lower speed to crush the enemy in front of you. So there was something similar in this regard. But maneuverability was also more complicated. You had just to go full in and see what would happen depending on the circumstances. Not all, right? You could carry out the aforementioned outflanking maneuvers, something like that. Those required a great training, right, of the crew, great timing, and we will see it now. And not everybody had the capacity of doing so, right? Not all the crews are trained to perform perfectly this maneuver, right? It's just like on land, like if you have just some raw militias, well, they're not going to be able to double envelope the enemy. They're simply not capable of doing so. The same goes with ships, and as we know, in war, most what you see is the good enough, right? So a sort of golden, medium gold standard of some sort that gets most of the stuff done, also quantitatively, not just qualitatively, unless there isn't a huge difference in the latter, which could happen, also just in terms of morale, right? Not just this technical expertise. Now, slow cruise was the final and usual method, by the way, of rowing on a long journey. It involved, for this, only some of the rowers in a rota system. In a trireme, for example, one bank would be normally manned and the other two banks were resting at slow cruise. Interestingly enough, as you know, galleys remained in use up to 3 centuries ago, and were still quite useful even in a time in which bigger ships with larger hulls, keels, and deeper draft existed, had become prevalent, especially when the sea depths were small, close to the coast. I don't know, the Swedish ones in the modern age still a lot of galley warfare because of this reason, for example, right? So we are lucky enough to know a substantial lot about galleys, right? But these are the ones, in fact, of just some centuries ago, right? There are still some questions to be answered about the older ones. About this more recent galleys, we know that they wouldn't attain speeds much in excess of 7 knots. That is something like 13 kilometers per hour, right? Ships in antiquity were, however, probably faster, right? Because they were lighter in build. Consider that artillery had just strengthened the general structure of the ships in the first place, leading also to the different designs with just greater mass that had to stabilize also for the accuracy of fire at some point. In the ancient world, everything was different regarding that. So galleys would be a bit more agile and so capable of performing more interesting feats. I will not descend here in the complicacies, right, of the probably naval engineering, because it's quite in fact, a difficult thing just per se. We may make a video about the whole thing, but let's say that we're also in this regard human factors connected to the different eras that played a large differences. For example, in ancient and medieval times, notoriously, rowers were freemen, were salaried workers who were also more willing and in better physical conditions than the prisoners of war in convicts who propelled the ships of the modern era, right when the Ottomans and the Christians began to fight each other in the Mediterranean, reviving that slave, let's say that forced slave labor on board. There were exceptions, by the way, in all these eras. But generally speaking, right, we're looking at, in ancient medieval times, at more motivated, better trained, and also, generally speaking, more, probably more directly involved individuals in the entire business, right? So this increased dramatically the syntony. It is not to say that, later galley warfare was somehow bad. As a consequence, everything was naturally fitting pretty high standards of military quality, as the ones that can be reached collectively, in fact, through, for example, the concerted use of firearms at some point, that changes really the entire warfare, like also the same tactics, and so on over time. Under oars, then, ancient galleys could attain up to 9 knots, so 16.5 kilometers per hour in speed. 4 to 5 knots at fast cruise, that is from 7.5 to a bit more than 9 kilometers per hour, and 3 knots at slow cruise, that is 5.5. Now, in attaining these speeds, as if we hadn't made it already abundantly clear, the training and the experience of the rowers was fundamental, right? Experienced oarsmen consistently outrowed the inexperienced ones and were in demand accordingly, just like the finest troops on the market would. Naturally, this depended also on who was enrolling them, how. Just think about how in Athens the Persian wars triggered, right, the rise of the satyrs properly as a social component that demanded more political representation in the polis and so on. So the crew training was in the hands either of let's say the various guilds that provided them, or the state, if this had been able to take over the entire system. So it took a while, of course, for a crew to work together efficiently. The esprit de corps was all one with the synchrony, the general spirit that was needed to conduct this pretty impressive physical exertions, by the way. Right, so it was really a matter of force, but not only. It was also really about this, like beating as a in unison, right, as a single heart to the movement, like feeling the movements of the ships, having an idea more or less of what was going on through the NCO, whoever directed, right, the rhythm. The sensorial experience of an ancient or medieval battle must have been really something impressive. So having an experienced crew that more or less knew already what was going on outside the ship was really crucial for even taking some, like, of course, discipline was of primary importance, but there was also a sense of the immediate capacities of reacting to whatever was going on. And constant practice was necessary to maintain performance. That is to say, if you do not do this over and over again, naturally with a limit, right, with a threshold beyond which you basically just start losing those same capacities. That training is good just for a certain amount. After that, it's even counterproductive, right? But at least the physical fitness, right? The sense that there was surely a peak in this career, an attention, also medical one, towards the rowers, that, as we've seen, were also freemen and considered as such, right? Was all one with properly the general organization, general cooperation of the entire, say, ship system. When on campaign, a fleet normally spent the day in exercises if opportunity offered, right? Because that would just maintain you fit for the next endeavor. So you couldn't simply sit there doing nothing. You had, also from a psychological point of view, you had to give these people a reason to take that extra more that was needed in the critical moment of combat, but still with steady nerves, cold blood, to be able to perfectly move these galleys in the best way possible. With a certain, it's a mathematical equation. After all, of course, what happens outside can, alter drastically, right, the ship performance. Just think about, a ram entering, the same ship side, or things like that. For not talking about the sea, right? Normally, just like pitched battles would normally be fought on suitable ground, so also the weather for sea battles was looked at, because otherwise the fleets could probably not even engage each other, right? They would have just spent too many resources for nothing. At the end of the day, you wouldn't know even how the situation could evolve. It could shipwreck altogether, something like that. So everything was, say, even more delicate to a degree in this naval warfare, which was a bit rougher, but also more riskily dictated, in fact, by these external factors, and also the contingent ones, just to the nature of the ship's structure, you couldn't quite simply surpass. As we were saying before, to compromise this situation came the cases of war, like ships often lacked full crews. So that's not quite a good thing, especially in combat, right? At one stage in the Peloponnesian War, for example, one Athenian fleet was down to less than 70% crews on average, right? That's really a consistent thing, because really you feel the ship also in a different way. You have to exert more force. The crew, the rowers must be distributed in a way that has to compensate properly with the different points of application of the force, which would alter the vectors at Similia. When in 249 BC the Romans besieged Lilybaeum, they lost so many rowers in the siege works against the city that a draft of 10,000 was needed before the fleet could again take the sea. Right, so the crews, including the rowers, were subject to severe losses when such, especially attritional warfare took place. Right, coming under coastal fortifications, assisting the landing force. It was a very risky business. Here we're not even talking about the structural damage to the ships, but just the losses, right? The losses of personnel. as you understand, another important factor was how much was actually embarked, which surpassed in importance the design of the ship itself, because it determined basically its performance and just what you could do with the galley in the first place, right? Mostly, a lot of gear had to be carried by the ship. The main mast and sail, as we were saying in the beginning, were always left ashore before battle, right? Which tells you how also not just how close to the coast the engagements took place, but how say the main engagements were meant like big battles, like a big one for all, right? And if you won, well, otherwise you were destroyed. So things would have been pretty messed up in the first place. So there were some specific limitations even to sailing, right? In case of defeat, or if you couldn't simply, gather your mast and sail. There was some stuff like the corbus, so a sort of harpooned catway to just hinge the enemy ship, and then pouring troops more easily on the deck, right? It could be used, and that was famous mostly during the First Punic War, because the Romans were fundamentally better into hand-to-hand fighting than the Carthaginians, and so they thought just to speed up the process of, say, pouring legionnaires on the Carthaginian decks. But this tool was considered still in the longer run, a handicap of some sort, because seemingly it unbalanced the entire ship, as you understand. It was evidently meant to be used in conditions where you could just come close to the enemy ship. Like, it wasn't like, okay, let's try to harpoon the enemy ship whilst trying to slip away. There were other ways to simply attract it, but this was, we do not know too much of how, also the various varieties of the corvus worked, would be used doctrinally. Just the Romans managed to defeat Carthage at sea, which tells you altogether with the mere fact that the Romans had the naval technology, how already advanced they were at such a relatively early age, so that you do not find the corvus much further, because when the Romans began to fully master the say naval warfare, they adapted to the general circumstances that had been just more important than their own greater or lesser capability to board the enemy. And so there is a bit of an anecdotal background to also the employment of these technologies. And the nature of naval warfare remained a bit just the same. So, more importantly, in terms of gear carried or general extra weight, the provisions, right? Warships normally had only about 3 days' stores, which meant that these were consumed while on the move. And so, depending on the day, if the ship was caught in passage when loaded with such material, this would have been a big disadvantage in combat. Of course, you could throw all the stuff overboard, which would have occurred, because, as we've seen, the ports were generally near, and sure, you would have not died of hunger or of thirst just in 3 days, right? But remember also the performance of the road. So emergential situations come first, but here we're looking at a tendency. You didn't have to overload the galley. It was not. It was mostly uniquely a matter of how much the rowers could sustain in each of these circumstances, either the slow sail or actual combat, right, with the stuff on. If ships were equipped with towers, these were usually prefabricated. so that it would be also jettisoned by a losing fleet, for example, to get more speed to escape, which seems very convenient. And we have just an idea of how many superstructures could be mounted on a deck, for example. How many, for example, catapults could be installed on a ship or stuff like that. So these are the quantities that we will never fully know, together with actually the more important ones about the general performance of the ships for navigation in combat or not. There was little to choose between different ancient warships in terms of speed, as we've seen. Larger ships had the advantage of large numbers of marines, which was also a very important factor overall. The smaller vessels did not have the same speed as bigger, nor lacking the reserves of rowers, the same endurance, right? On the other hand, they could make up for this by cheapness and maneuverability. So it's always the same story. If you take something off from somewhere, you have to add it to another. So a bit like in terrestrial armies, you had an elite, right? A heavy elite, fundamentally, that you use for smashing power, but for that much, you must have a larger amount of lighter troops that have to basically pave the way for this force that is usually held. The way things would be, reserves would be maintained is slightly different at sea, right? But at least you must still render this engagement harmonious as far as the concert of all these various instruments is concerned. It's, for example, obvious that the Hellenistic and Roman powers at some point developed some monstrously large ships that in part were just, especially the Hellenistic ones, prototypes, like certain things were used even only once sometimes. Other times they were instead more structurally integrated in broader fleets, and that, however, were effective because besides those, there were so many others that would have just, with that critical mass, shattered all the minor powers that didn't have, as we were saying before, much of a chance against these at sea, especially in early imperial Roman times. Now, about the maneuverability, and so the possibility of eluding, right, the bigger vessels, though, which could still happen, and it's not all so simple as, for example, it's usually said at the pick the Battle of Salamis, right? The Greeks won because they had just more maneuverable ships, and on average, you can say that was a factor, but alone was not the decisive one. Nor you can simply historically identify it, nor the average means that the Persians didn't have altogether some equivalent of that. So certain statements are a bit commonplaces, like people think that, I don't know, bronze wins copper and iron wins bronze, or this kind of things in for hand-to-hand combat for melee in the millennia before God. This is not really how it happened, right? We as we were saying at the beginning, the type of troops and technologies that are put against one another throughout history, and especially the older back in time you go, are ever more similar to one another, right? Today we have much greater technological gap between a system and another, but we get the impression now we are so because the modernistic bias, but we're so advanced that today everybody's advanced, right? Not really, right? There is a much lower difference, of course, between our, in that sense, different leagues, different types of weapons in ancient or medieval times, nor today. Like, telling the truth, this is the point, right? Technology has never, historically speaking, made the difference in the sense that it represented a 50% plus one. Never, right? What people like to do is to develop a morally relativistic system without any scientific consistency that tells you that something that counts, let's say like 2%, when the odds are balanced at, say, 50%, can make the difference. Yes, but excluding from the equation all the other factors that are at some point individually even more important than that too, that made up that 50%, right? So you can't quite just say that we are in any of these contexts in front of like just primitives versus ultra advanced technology, and nor in other times in history when the gap was even wider. This meant that the more technologically advanced had to win in the first place. This is literally the ABC of military history. If you haven't gotten over the stuff yet, it's unlikely that you can make much other step further in the field. So, as we've seen, even the differences in speed were not excessive, right? We would probably be impressed by how slow these maneuvers would appear in the first place. But as we were saying before, it was also about putting in motion this enormous amount of mass, right? So that even a minimal difference in speed equated to a much greater amount of force exerted at contact. Now, on the enemy, right, to damage him. Things could go wrong, by the way, and also for those who performed attacks, right? Generally speaking, they had the upper hand, but not always. As we were noticing before, maneuvers were just a way to. You could, for example, remain stuck in the same ship that you had just rammed, which was not a good thing. As we hinted at before, the primary use of the sail was to rest the rowers, right? It could be done intermittently during the navigation. We're talking about like 6-7 knots as the likely reasonable speed for a warship under sail. So slightly faster than a merchant vessel. Talking about essentially something between 11 and 13 kilometers per hour. Interestingly enough, this is only half the speed attained by modern sailing vessels. So things have not changed dramatically in perspective, depending, of course, which parameters you take. But it was a good speed. Vessels designed to operate under oars and sail, which did exist, and the thing could be performed in the first place, but some were specifically designed for it, in fact, may have attained up to 10 knots or more. So we're talking about almost 20 kilometers per hour, which is also impressive. So far we have seen speed, but what about steering? What about the general maneuverability of these galleys, especially in combat, right? When they could perform, as we've seen, the top maneuver was again the diecplus, the periplus, as they were known in ancient Greece. Well, turning circles was a bit like the standard. Like, they probably trained a lot to do that because it was as much as you can steer, right? That's a very important thing in any vehicle, how much you can wheel about. Now, this naturally reflected the general maneuverability of the ship. Variation was, of course, depending on the vessel size. because the oars as well as the efficient steering oars were used in the turn, and the efficiency of the crew was thus again paramount. The steering oar or board is this essentially oversized oar or board, in fact, to control the direction of the ship, right, or other watercraft before the invention of the rudder that was just operated from still from the deck, but with another mechanism, for the ship to be aligned perfectly with the ship axis and achieving relatively greater precision in maneuver. Now, even using the steering oars alone, vessels were quite handy despite their length. As we were saying before, they were generally more agile than what we can see for the latest galleys in the history of warfare. At a battle speed that, as we've seen, was particularly sustained, the turning circle may have been 75 meters in diameter, right? Taking something like 1 minute approximately to do all the circle. Another maneuver that didn't require as much capacity, but was still quite important for also the general order of the battle line formation, was backing water, right? A considerable amount of time in combat would be spent carrying this out, right? So in other words, rowing back, reversing the direction of the boat, especially pushing the oars of a rowing boat to slow it down or stop it, and going in reverse, which was usually done specifically either to avoid outflanking, right? So to prevent, of course, that this would, generally speaking, be carried out not just going backwards, but trying to curve yourself or stuff like that, but also to keep the ram pointed towards the enemy, because you didn't want, even in a kind of static situation when all the galleys were crammed together, any gap to open, right, in the process. Because differently from land battles, and I made specific videos about this, entering the gaps was dangerous, was more dangerous at least than for the defenders than it usually was in land, right? It was still an important risk for the attacker, but the idea is that battle lines were also, of course, there were different rows, different ranks of ships at a point that were, in fact, also disposed in a way that would try to avoid this diekplus, so literally going between the ships. Some of them would be tied, even chained, stuff like that. So it was not really just per se the most frequent thing that could happen, but it still was necessary to prevent the enemy to just manage to infiltrate or to attack you from, even at a low speed, from an angle that would put you in difficulty as far as even boarding was concerned, still leaving you an important capacity of maneuver yourself, right? So as you understand, there is a bit of contradiction, at least of back and forth, right? They weren't always doing the same thing, right? And I made videos about naval tactics at this point, on, for example, Byzantine warfare in the High Middle Ages and so on. And you understand that sources sometimes say strange things because maybe they were just copying others without understanding the meaning or whatever, inspiring to classical sources. Even if maybe they knew how an actual combat took place, this is typically Byzantine, just to stick to the canons rather than reality, even when you knew how things really were. But there is still an enormous debate regarding how this these engagements would actually take place, or at least there is just a limit beyond which we do not really know how things really happen, right? So that we have to arrive a bit to the modern age, in other times where tactics, even naval structures, change considerably, right? Sweeping, for example, the enemy deck with a mitraille fire is very different from, say, engaging it like with even with liquid fire, or, well, at that point would be just to set and fire the ship, telling the truth, which was quite dangerous. We would also like to stay away. But missile fire, this fire was also an issue, of course, in the first place. I mean, incendiary weapons, because even just think, maybe imagine you're losing. You can't, because you're cramped altogether. You can't say, okay, well, if we have to lose, I will set and fire the whole freaking thing. And that's why they didn't have the mast, the sails in combat, because those would have been the favorite target to set an enemy ship on fire. So everything was a tremendous mess. And again, still, most of the engagement was constituted by this melee, literally during boarding and missile exchange, and the ramming would also be relatively limited. This depended also on the ship design, right? Ramming is more of an ancient thing than later times, because there was at some point a greater, say, there were heavier ships in the first place, whereas when things got a bit smaller, like the Vexillaciones in the late Empire, you see that the Dromans, some were, I mean, ramming came back different times in history, even in time of ironclads, telling the truth, as you perfectly know, at least I hope. But the ships were smaller, so the power, the mass, the chance that they would simply sink themselves by smashing into one another was reduced, which wasn't even such an easy thing to, or sometimes, that practical thing to do regularly in an engagement, even in ancient times, right? So very complicated things. I will probably make a video about ramming just per se, because it seems very it's incredibly more complicated than you would normally think it is, right? Some sort of proof of force, smashing everything is in the way. Actually, it had to be perfectly calibrated with the barycenter of the ship, otherwise you just risk making a mess and putting yourself in quite difficult situations. But this for today was it. It was, again, very simple, say, inquiry on the basics of these ships' performances. Nothing pretentious. We will, of course, look in this series at the various ships types that we've already, I think, talked about. The Phoenician bireme, we talked even about the Roman merchantman, because even, that the distinction between the civil and the military, let's say, designs was relative at the time. This is true also for an important part of the Middle Ages, right? So I hope we are going to dig more into naval warfare that, again, subordinated to land warfare as it is still very important and deserves great attention. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.